Story number 1. The story of my life unfolded during the summer season. My wife and I were planning to take a vacation, but we had not decided on a place of rest. I suggested going to my relatives, as there was a river and a beautiful forest nearby, and it was completely free to relax. I doubted the need to spend a lot of money for a vacation. However, my wife was not convinced. She always disliked my suggestions. She decided to call her friend Lillian and inquire about her vacation plans. The next morning, I left for work, leaving my wife at home. When I returned in the evening, she excitedly informed me that my wish had come true. We were going on vacation to her mother's house. I was thrilled at the prospect of saving money and having a nice vacation. Allison, my wife's mother, is a kind woman who looks younger than her 53 years. She used to work as a school teacher, but then due to downsizing, she switched to part-time work as a tutor. My father-in-law, a trucker, often goes on business trips, delivering various goods to different cities in America. He is characterized by a mild and calm nature. When everything was packed, we got into the car and went to their place. We got there quickly, but my wife scolded me for going to her mom's house instead of to the beach near the sea. She called me greedy, but I paid no attention to her complaints. I was glad to be near the river, especially since the weather was nice and relaxing. Their house was 2 stories high. When my mother-in-law saw us, she was happy and invited us into the house. We sat down at the table and drank coffee and cookies, talking about various topics. Later, the mother-in-law took us to the second floor and showed us the room where we would be staying. Feeling a little tired, I told my wife that I would take a shower before going to bed and go to bed. She went downstairs to chat with her mother. The next morning, my wife woke me up and told me to have breakfast and then go to the river to swim and sunbathe. I agreed, and on reaching the river, we found a suitable place, undressed, and decided to swim in the river. The first to enter the water was my wife, followed by my mother-in-law. I stayed behind, watching them both, especially my mother-in-law. I had not noticed before how beautiful her figure was. However, my wife interrupted my musings by urging me to join them in the water. I complied and went for a swim, and so wanted to watch my mother-in-law some more. The water was pleasantly warm, and we swam for a long time before heading out to sunbathe. Our vacation had already lasted 3 days, during which time I found myself admiring my already tanned mother-in-law more and more. I think she noticed my glances, and when our eyes met, she just smiled. On the 4th day of our stay, an unexpected event happened. We woke up as usual, had our morning coffee, and went to the river. Toward lunchtime, however, my wife started to get a headache. We quickly packed up and returned home. Once home, my wife took her medicine and lay down to rest, while I sat in the kitchen while my mother-in-law prepared dinner. Watching her, I decided to get something to drink from the refrigerator. As I walked past my mother-in-law, I inadvertently touched her. She turned around, and it seemed to me that she was glad of the touch. Not knowing what came over me, I moved closer and put my hand on her waist. To my surprise, my mother-in-law didn't resist. Moreover, she seemed to want it. After checking to see if my wife was asleep, my mother-in-law turned back to me. She smiled, told me to lie down on the table, and what followed was an unexpected but brief moment of passion. Despite its brevity, it became one of the most memorable of my life. I had in no way expected such skill from my mother-in-law. When I go home, I will fondly remember these precious moments spent with the most wonderful mother-in-law in the world. Story number 2. I am going to share with you what I witnessed in the relationship between my mother-in-law and the young man, without adding any fiction. Let me briefly describe my wife's parents. The father-in-law, 49, used to be a police officer, now works as a security guard at a store and likes to have a couple of beers. Mother-in-law, 44, has worked as a restaurant cook all her life. She is of average height, has a moderate build, and is a sweet woman. They have a daughter named Sarah, whom I married over 2 years ago. The incident occurred at their country home when my father-in-law invited his acquaintance, Uncle Jason, and his son Jerry to help with some home renovations. While we worked, my mother-in-law cooked dinner outside. In the evening after a long day of work, we sat around the table to eat. Everyone but me indulged in whiskey and ended up getting drunk. Drunk people tend to speak frankly, and I overheard some interesting conversations before retiring to my room to rest. Throwing a scornful glance at my father-in-law, who was shamelessly admiring my mother-in-law's physique in front of his friends, young Jerry watched the conversation with wide-eyed wonderment, his mouth ajar at what he had heard. What happened next was a mystery to me, as I only heard my mother-in-law, Uncle Jason, and Jerry helping the passed-out father-in-law to the next room. It appeared that Uncle Jason was also quite drunk, as he was struggling to support his father-in-law. To my surprise, my mother-in-law and Jerry decided to go outside together. I was intrigued by their actions and quietly took my binoculars and snuck up to the attic. As I peered through the lens, I saw my mother-in-law spreading a blanket in a secluded spot between the greenhouse, the veranda wall, and the fence, with Jerry next to her. It was obvious they were up to something my mother-in-law wouldn't like. Once the blanket was spread out, the most unexpected thing began. After a long kiss, the most interesting thing began. I was shocked at what I saw. Meanwhile, Uncle Jason got up and went in search of his mother-in-law and son, leaving me to ponder the outcome with bated breath. I expected a scandal or even a physical fight when he learned of their whereabouts. However, my assumptions proved to be wrong. Uncle Jason quickly discovered the lovers' whereabouts at the most touching moment when the mother-in-law was in an interesting position on the ground. Instead of intervening, he quietly nestled himself against the veranda wall and was completely stunned by what he saw. Once again, Uncle Jason's actions took me by surprise. He stayed there for a moment, then silently retreated to his bedroom. Following his example, I left my hiding place and retreated to my room, pondering the events I had just witnessed. A couple hours later, I heard the voices of my mother-in-law, Jerry, and Uncle Jason outside. Consumed with curiosity, I joined them. Eventually, Uncle Jason and Jerry said goodbye to us and left, and my mother-in-law retired to her husband's room as if nothing had happened. I don't know if Jerry's involvement was a one-time thing or the result of intoxication. Nevertheless, the next morning when everyone woke up, my mother-in-law acted as if nothing had happened during the night. Now, I don't know if I should discuss this with my mother-in-law or just leave it at that. Story number 3. I don't know how this could have happened to me, but nothing can be changed. My name is Pamela, and I recently celebrated my 45th birthday. I live in a rural area, and my daughter Emma recently got married. Although she is only 25 years old, she is deeply in love with her husband of 37 years, who is almost twice her age. To be honest, he is old enough to be her father, but I refrain from interfering in their relationship and leave them to figure it out for themselves. Before my grandson was born, Emma was an excellent student, a bright girl, and most importantly, beautiful. Childbirth changed her dramatically, resulting in weight gain and sleepless nights due to the baby's needs. According to my daughter, Brian, her husband was constantly busy with work and did not provide any help. So I made the decision to go to their town and help with the baby, as my daughter would not be able to bear it for long. Emma met me with tears of joy in her eyes, grateful to have someone around to support her. Her husband works all the time, leaving her alone with the baby at home. As we rode in the cab to her house, I took one look at her and was shocked. Her hair was a mess. She looked unkempt, just awful and all. She looked nothing like my beautiful daughter. Without thinking, I advised her, "Emma, you need to clean yourself up. After the baby is born, your relationship with your husband will suffer if you don't." Emma was silent, but I could see the emotion in her eyes, so I didn't insist. Once I got to the apartment, I settled into the bedroom and sent my daughter to the salon to get her makeup done and go shopping. I wanted her to have a good time while I looked after my grandson. In doing so, she informed me that Brian had to leave on a business trip that day and would not be back soon. As soon as my daughter left, I set about cleaning, cooking, and putting the house in order. By the time I was done, it was getting dark outside. Emma called and said she was staying the night at a friend's house. I put my grandson to bed and sat down with a book. When the door opened, Brian, my son-in-law, walked in looking tired. He headed straight for the shower, and I invited him to join the table. He was delighted with the food I had prepared, noting that Emma almost never cooks and usually orders takeout. He jokingly remarked that I must not have taught her how to cook. I felt so ashamed of my daughter, and I realized that this was going to be a difficult conversation. I took out 2 glasses and poured red wine, and then my son-in-law started complaining. "How tired I am, Pamela. Now my eyes have been opened. Now I can see the difference in age with my wife. She's young, she talks to her friends, and I don't even understand them. And after the birth of my son, she hardly gives me any time." And meanwhile, he put his hand on my knee and started stroking. While my son-in-law was complaining about the draught, we emptied the whole bottle. Brian said many compliments to me, and then a long kiss followed. At that moment, unbeknownst to ourselves, the darkness of the bedroom engulfed us. That's when it first happened for us. In the morning, of course, I was ashamed to even look him in the eyes, but he embraced me and said that it would be our joint secret. And where can I go? What was, was. But when this story happened again, I decided to leave before I ruined my daughter's family. In the morning, I told my son-in-law that it was a mistake. I realized that my daughter, after having a child, has changed for the worse. But you promised to love her as she is, and what happened last night will never happen again. I'll do anything to change my daughter so you can live happily ever after.